The so happy and thankful that you are here, that you are taking your time to be with our students. We've been reading through some of the students' reflections and work on Black Dove, and I know they've got a lot to say. They got a lot out of the book. So we're so
Oh,
grateful.
thank
Before
you.
we begin, I would like to introduce the Puente team or allow them to introduce themselves. I'm just going to go in order across the top. So Professor Razzo.
Hello, my name's Stephanie Razzo, and I'm one of the Puente English instructors. Just thank you so much for being here today, Anna. It's such an honor. And
You.
the students and I, we've had such a great time reading your book, and we're just so excited to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to see
And
you.
Ms. Gonzalez.
Buenos dias, Ana. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Brenda Gonzalez, and I'm one of the counselors for the program.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wembes.
Hi, Anna. My name is Justin Wembes, and I'm a counselor in the program as well. We have two cohorts, so just really happy to be here and share this space with you. And thank you for coming on. And
Thank,
looking forward to it.
thank you.
And Cristina.
Good morning, Anna. My name is Cristina Gomez. I serve as the administrative assistant supporting the Puente program. And it is such an honor to be here, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Okay, so for the second event, I have a little bit more of a formal introduction. The introduction here is going to be a little bit more brief because we all feel like we know you already. We've read about your childhood. We've read about your experiences growing up in Chicago, in traveling to Mexico, your parents and your grandparents' lives, your marriage, and some of your other romantic relationships, your experiences as a mother and a single mother, and then your son Marcelo's life as he grew older, some of the challenges that he faced, some of the ways that I think society viewed him as a young man of color. So we feel like we've been with you throughout the way. So I'm not going to give the full introduction. I'll save that for the second event. And I know the Puente students all have questions and thoughts. So I'd like to just open it up for you. I know you plan to read a little bit, which it's always great to hear an author's work in their own voice. So yeah, I'd like to pass the floor on to Ana Castillo.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought that I would just start out with reading from the very beginning of Black Dove, and thank you everybody for reading and for your responses and for being here this morning with me. I have been giving public writing workshops for several years now. I'd come to around 2008 with the recession, I'd come to the conclusion that one of the ways that I could serve people would be through my writing experience and my writing skills. And most of my readers, not all of my readers, but most of my readers are people of color, primarily Latinos, Latinas, cross-generationally, across this country. And what I have found and what I came to believe is that one of our drawbacks in our various communities, we don't have one Latino community, we have many kinds of Latino communities, but cross-generationally, one of the things about our cultures, our cultures, our way of being, and maybe it's mostly in this country, is our resistance and our hesitation to document our stories, to write our stories. We share them. We are storytellers. We tell them across kitchen tables and from parent to grandparent, grandparent to parent, to child to grandchild. But writing is a different thing. And it's not just writing in Spanish, it's the whole strange act of writing. So I decided around that time, although I had been teaching for a long time and had taught memo writing and personal essay writing and so on, is to reach out with that particular genre. So I have all kinds of advice, all kinds of tips as to how to write memoirs, how to write your story. I've got a lot of encouragements and, all kinds of tricks in my bag to get people to get started writing on their story. But, when it came down to myself, it's the same thing. It's like walking your talk. Can I tell my story? I experienced the same thing that I told other people. It's like, you've got to write your story. It's your story. It's your right to tell the story. But then, of course, when it's time to tell your story, especially when you think the public's somebody out there's going to read it, my mother-in-law's going to read it, or, my mother's going to read it, or my brother's they're going to argue with me about it, or my ex is going to read it. So you go through all these things in your head, or maybe I'm going to get sued. All those things that I would reassure people about came to my mind at this time where I just decided to sit down and walk my talk and talk in my head with, all the things that I had been telling people of all ages and all backgrounds, all educational backgrounds, the same thing, it's your story to tell. And I did all the things that I told people to do, which is to not censor yourself. You could always delete, you could always not show it to anybody. Don't talk about it to too many people because, you start to get everybody's opinion. Do the research, talk to certain people. And if you feel at any point that what you're talking about, if you're talking about your family, your upbringing, or a relationship that you have, do you think you should share it? If you think you should share it or maybe run it by the person, then do so. The story about my son, I did share with him, and he's been on board the whole time. And as you see, we also included, upon the editor's request, some of the exchanges that we had when he was locked up. We were able to have email exchanges, and I, of course, printed out all the emails. They're not private emails to begin with. They are, of course, watched. So we're not saying much. I found myself philosophizing a lot when I would talk to him, but you can't really talk too much about details because you get sort of paranoid about that. And then they also asked about including his voice, and the essay that's in the book, What's in a Nombre, was something that I got him to write when I received the request about a new magazine that was coming out, a Latino magazine, and they were asking that question, what's in your name? And, I was so concerned about him, and I'm so private that I made a new email address for him. And I used that address to submit for him. And then I was remiss on checking that address, and he did get accepted, but I never checked back, and so it didn't happen. So I included that essay in this book. So, and he has in Chicago, he did, and my granddaughter appear with me at bookstores and book signings and things like that, and happily signed books and talked about it. And our discussion was that we wanted to share this with everybody, but particularly with our communities, because we have these unfortunate stories in our families. If it's not your brother, it's your ex-husband, it might be your dad. I actually have had college students who've told me that their dads have been locked up or were locked up during their childhood. And so these are not things, obviously, that people, once again, we don't feel comfortable sharing these stories. I've had people that are not Latino tell me their sons had this experience, and they were very moved by my telling this story. They felt like I was telling their story. So I think that objective worked out for us. The beginning of the book, which was originally going to be the theme until my son, photobombed that, so to speak, that idea, was my mother's Mexico. And I wrote my mother's Mexico when my mother was still alive. And she was also a hyper private person that just freaked out at the whole idea about me being a writer and asked me not to write our stories. But I did write this and publish this originally when she was still with me. And I wanted to read the first couple of pages to you, because one of the things that I often tell people in my memoir writing workshops and courses is a memoir versus an autobiography is your memory. An autobiography is usually chronological, and hopefully it has a lot of facts and dates and things like that in it. Whereas your memoir is memory, and it's your memory. It may not be a correct memory. Your twin brother may disagree with you about certain things in your childhood because you both have retained memory differently and have translated it differently for yourself. But this was one of the first times that I actually wrote something so personal. And I had just come back from Mexico City. So I'm going to share that with you. And one of the main tips that I suggest to people in your memoir essays is to use the voice that you speak to yourself in your head with. You know, we ask, you know, what's the language? It's not empirical language. It's like writing a paper for your, science course, but how you communicate. And if you communicate to yourself in Spanish or bilingually, that would be the truest voice to write in for your memoir. And so I just wanted to read a little bit so that you can hear my voice and how I heard it in my head as I began to write this some time ago. My mother's Mexico was the brutal urban reality. Luis Buñuel's Los Fire Eaters, hubcap stealers, chiclet sellers, miniature accordion players with small, dirty hands stretched out before passers-by for a coin, a piece of bread. Please, senor, for my mother who is very sick. This was the Mexico City of my family. This was the Mexico from which my mother spared me. In that Mexico City in the 1930s, Mama was a street urchin with one ragged dress, but not an orphan, not yet. Because of an unnamed skin disease that covered her whole tiny body with scabs, her head was shaved. At 7 years old, or maybe 8, she scurried quick and invisible as a Mayan messenger through the throngs of that ancient metropolis in the area known as La Villita, where the goddess Guadalupe Tonantzin had made her 4 divine appearances and ordered El Indio Juan Diego 4 times to tell the Catholic officials to build her a church. Yes, and off he went, sure-footed and trembling. Mama, who was not Mama, but little then, bustled on her own mission toward the corner where her stepfather sold used paperbacks on the curb. At midday, he ordered his main meal from a nearby restaurant and ate it out of stainless steel carryout containers without leaving his place of business. The little girl would take the leftovers and dash them off to her mother, who was lying on a petate in the one room the whole family shared in a vecindad, overflowing with families like their own, with all manner of maladies that accompany destitution. Her mother was dying. Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to welcome questions. Thank you, so that we don't take all my time me talking, but I'd like to hear any questions that you all may have from your readings or about writing or writing memoir.
So I think we have a long list of questions. I'm just going to ask students who have a question, raise your hand and I'll try to keep track so that I can call on you one at a time so we don't all just unmute and talk at once. So if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand now. And keep your hand up so I can keep track, and we'll start with Rebecca.
Hi, Ana Castillo.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, how has the writing community changed from when you started to now?
Well, my mother would have said that actually, she did say to a whole audience that I've been writing since, I guess I learned how to write since I was very tiny. And it was just something that came to me. But I say that I started writing around between 1921, like when I was already, like in community college and so on. And at that point, since high school, I was already getting very involved in the neighborhood and in community and grassroots efforts toward working towards social change. So I viewed my writing basically was an extension of that, expressing that, a way to combine my creativity with that. And never in my wildest dreams at that time that I think that I was going to get published or that I was going to be a writer or that I was going to be doing anything formally, so all the way from that to maybe a couple of decades later, I worked very hard, but I was fortunate enough to be part of the forefront of Latinas in this country that began to quote unquote quote cross over. And I was a grown woman by then, of course. I was in my 30s and had many books already that I had been working on and were getting published by small presses. So I've seen like the beginning from a little bit all the way to, where we crossed over and we became the flavor of the month and, many other different people and ethnicities and all kinds of things have been going on. And then of course, now we have the digital world that has blown everything wide open. So I've seen it go from like nothing. I was a great, avid reader and would go to the small bookstores. I was, I guess, a young nerd, and I'd go to bookstores looking hungry for something that spoke to my experience. And I can remember in my late teens, some of the Latin American boom was translated to English, but most of them were men. Elena Poniatowska, who I had the great gift to get to know later and become a personal friend with at that time, was maybe one of the very few women. But Poniatowska, I mean, she's the granddaughter of a Polish prince. I mean, I was looking for people that were like spoke to our experience. In my writing, I began to put in on the page what I didn't see, which were women that I knew. When Chicanos began to publish just before the women did, because now we not only had an ethnic struggle, we also have a gender struggle and so on. And the women were portrayed pretty much twofold, either the madre sufrida or the puta with the golden heart, the bad girl that was still very kind. I mean, we had like cliches in the early Chicano writing. And so I was looking for somebody that was brown and beautiful like my mother and strong like that and foreboding and people that talk like I did. And so that wasn't there. And I began to put that on the page. Fortunately, part of a generation that little by little, I got to know the other people who were doing that around the country. But that's really the whole long journey. I've been there like from the start to where we are now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a list of questions here that I could read from. Oh, I see Joshua's hand up. Go ahead, Joshua.
Hello, Anna.
Hola.
Yeah, I just want to ask, how are you keeping yourself safe and entertained during this COVID pandemic?
Well, I'm keeping myself safe by mostly staying in my home. I, many years ago, moved to southern New Mexico. I'm out in un ranchito in the desert, and I am able to go outside and, be with my animals, and even though it's just desert, get fresh air and sunshine. And that's really, I mean, that was one of the draws for me, is to have that, be able to have that. And I think that it's very important for us to have fresh air and exercise. That's part of your taking care of yourself and you're staying safe and healthy, is getting your vitamin D and being out and communing. And I mean, I've shut down most of going out except to go to do groceries and errands. So that's it. I've seen my own peers and friends on Facebook that are out visiting each other and going and doing things. I think it's really not a good idea. So I do encourage everybody to just keep it to a minimum as much as possible. And remember that COVID, and just like other diseases and viruses, doesn't have a moral imperative. Just because that's your best friend or your prima, it doesn't mean that, that you can't catch the flu from them. And that's what, this is the same way of contracting that. So don't feel safe just because you know somebody. And staying sane, we're just barely, we're like this right now with not only the next 48 hours, but also with the weeks and months to come because of the obvious eminent controversy that's going to be taking place with the elections. I do hope that everybody that's able to vote has gone and put in their vote. I hope you didn't go rogue and put in somebody that you know that you would like to be president, because that's not going to help right now. We can think about those things for the future, but not for right now. So those are some of the things that are going on. It's been difficult in the last 4 years. And I'll just say, one of the things that I did, because I became very, very depressed, like PTSD 4 years ago. And I just felt that after 40 years of writing, as I just answered the previous question, I started writing as a political activist. And when we had that surprise result, I just completely shut down, and I felt that there was no point in writing. Why had I written? Why had I spoken out? Why had I taken all the chances that I had taken if it was all going to come to this? And I went back to my original love, which was doing art. And so the other thing I do to stay sane is I've been doing drawings used to be with pen and ink, and now they're with Sharpies, but I've been doing these almost on a daily basis for the last 4 years. So I also recommend for you to pick up something that you enjoy, that's calming for you, to kind of get out of your head.
Thank you, Ana Castillo.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Thank you, and we'll certainly address the election some more in the second event as well. Laura, I see your hand up.
Hola, Ana.
Hi, buenos días.
Buenos días. So my question is inspired from the chapter When I Die in Oaxaca. So it is about your near-death experience that you've had there. And my question is, what is the most meaningful thing or things you have done after your near-death experience? What actions you have taken afterward regarding life enjoyment?
Well, I don't think that I changed much. I mean, because to begin with, I've had a life of feeling very connected spiritually, which I got from my home, and I've spoken about that with my abuelita and so on. And like everyone, you have questions about, afterlife, and if you've grown up with a certain religion, you begin to question it in your late teens, usually, sometimes sooner. Certainly as a feminist, I question religious doctrine and so on. And then you have sentimental reasons and family reasons why you might hang on to certain parts of beliefs. But so I don't think, when I had that experience that I was about to change entirely. The thing about having a near-death experience, that does put you and afterwards I saw documentaries and read about people that had this experience. It kind of elevates you to another state of being for a while, like you're almost euphoric. You're just naturally euphoric, and I went on a book tour when I got back to the States, and everywhere I was talking about it, like, it's okay, it'll be fine, don't worry, that is not a horrible experience. It's like you're in another place. And that, that sort of stays with me now that I'm older, and and this atmosphere that we're living in and experiencing so much illness, and people that we know who are ill or dying or died. I've remembered that, and so what it really does is just put me in a calm place to not feel anxiety about what comes after death. As a mother, as a woman who gave birth naturally, and so I experienced seeing my son born, giving birth to my son, I always remind myself of that transformation. And so it's more of just a state of me being, of meaning for one, in terms of what you're going to, as I understand your question, the near-death experience didn't say like, well, let me now experience my bucket list and check everything out because it could happen anytime. It's sort of the opposite. It's like if you got a sense of direction, and you're living your life as best as you can already, and you're mindful about your body and so on, well, what more can you do but just, understand that everything that you're doing, is temporal, and you just do the best that you can, or be as sincere as you can. Um, and you understand that it's a transition, just like when you got here. Like, just like you wonder, where will I go after I die? You might ask yourself, where was I before I got here? Because, I remember when I was very young and I thought about this, like, children still kind of remember, little children under 7 years old, they kind of remember, have a memory of where they were before they came here. And so it's more of a state of being than me deciding there's a list that I have to check off, because it could happen again. It's going to happen. We don't know. It's going to happen to everybody sooner or later. So it really is about just living your life anyway, in the best, with the best conscience that you have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question and response, given that it's Day of the Dead when we sort of honor those who have passed on, or perhaps gone back. So here's a question from Cynthia Mahano. Why is Chicana feminism an important framework to have for the Latinx community?
It's the beginning, and in my book, Massacre of the Dreamers, Essays on Chicanismo, which was published over 25 years ago. And the 20th anniversary edition came out 5 years ago with some updates. It's an important framework because it was a time in which US Latinas and some Latinos and US and Chicanas began to enter into the dialogue publicly. We experienced our social consciousness as brown women, as women who recognized our indigenous heritage, who recognize our Mexican culture and celebrated it, who also recognized many of us were the first ones educated or first to go to college, and came from working class parents who came here and worked in the steel mills in the Midwest, who worked in the files factories. And so we had all of this to address, and we also personally experienced very serious racism within our own activist communities. We're experiencing sexism and misogyny, and people who would identify today as queer and were at that time might have called themselves gay or lesbian because it was more binary at that time, were also experienced not only prejudice and violation of their own rights in the general society, but also within activist communities. So all of that was about documenting, researching, and putting forth a language and asserting an existence that can work as a framework for people today. And you don't have to agree with everything that I said 20, 30 years ago, or even half of what I said, but I established a language, a term, and I think very importantly, made an announcement to the world that we exist and we have these things in common and we have these bridges to connect or cross. It also talked about the relations we have with Mexicans and Mexican women. And at that time, part of that dialogue was Chicanas talking with Mexican women writers and intellectuals and feminist activists. And what do we have in common? What don't we have in common? What misconceptions do we have each way about each other before we can just dismiss each other? There was a lot of misconception in Mexico about Chicanas, thinking that because you were born in the United States and you speak English and that you're a US citizen, that you have all the privileges of any gringo or gringa and you got all this going for you. And as I said, that was not the case. And unfortunately, is still not the case. We've made some progress. We haven't made nearly enough. And we seem to be fighting about going backwards. So that's what I would say is I did the best that I could, but certainly that's not meant to sound like an apology because it took a lot to do what we were doing then. And there's still a lot more to go. And I see, especially this year, a great deal of energy and courage coming out of the Latinx communities and Chicanx communities, which I'm fully behind and hoping for the best, and sad that we have to continue to experience a lot of what we were fighting against 40, 50 years ago, 30 years ago.
Thank you. Yeah, it reminds me in the book when you talk about, being a Chicana in the US and perceived as an outsider, then you travel back to Mexico and once again perceived as an outsider. So I see Jimena has a question.
Hi, Ana. Buenos dias. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
A question I have today for you is, what advice would you give to young people who are still trying to figure out who they are in terms of their identity?
Do you mean identity ethnically or sexual identity or all of the above? Or because
Yeah, just
different times, different things are important to you.
Just a general one, like in general, identify with yourself in general.
We're always in the process of coming into being. And just when you figure that out, you're moving to a different decade in your life and you've got different challenges. So your identity, so to speak, is always evolving. There's like a semilla, there's a root. It's not like you become somebody entirely different when you turn 30 from your 20s. So you're always setting the groundwork for that. Some people are gifted in the sense that they know early on what they want out of life, what they pursue. They don't waver from that. I knew someone who knew since he was a child that I don't know how this came to him, but he knew he wanted to be a historian, like since he was a little kid. Like, what little kid wants to be a historian? And that's what he did. He grew up and he went on to school and university, and he's a historian. So we always thought that was sort of a funny story because, like, how do you know these things? But some people do. And then on the other hand, some people don't ever quite, can't quite find their niche, maybe because they're multi-talented. They never quite figure out what community or what work they want to devote themselves to. But you do have to put your all in what you're behind. There is a core for you, and that core has to do with your allegiances and what you think is right and wrong. And so your identity begins to form itself with that. Do I believe in human rights? Do I believe in working with climate change? Do I not care? Do I just want to make money? Do I want, to be a mom? Do I want to, be an artist? Whatever those things are, wherever your passion leads you, you put your all in all behind it. And something along the way might push you, might derail you. And then you say, well, I don't think that that's for me. But then that becomes part of your identity anyway. You'll never forget that part of you. That becomes something that you always fall back on or bring into your shaping yourself. When you're in your 20s, you go through so much, but then you think you're all that because you're already an adult and nobody can tell you nothing. And so, you know it all until you turn 30, and then you think, oh no, now what? And you have to really start adulting. And then at 40, now you have children that are looking up to you, and you have parents that are beginning to depend on you. So your identity changes again as a truly responsible person. So you're always going to have some challenge. So that base that you begin to form very early on is something that if you look back on it, you can start to see, you can sort of look into the future by seeing what have you been doing so far? What's been important to you so far? And the thing that you can't shake is probably something that's going to follow you, and you'll either build on it or regretfully not pay attention to it and have these periods of self-doubt. So I really recommend for younger people to not be afraid of trying the things that they're passionate about, but you've got to put your all in all into it, and not and not feel discouraged because there are some obstacles in the way. I was told by Chicanas once that my work was everywhere, my books were everywhere. Chicanas my age would say to me, Ana, I always wanted to be a writer, but when I was coming up, or when I was going to college, or when I started school, there were no Chicana writers. And I said, there were no Chicana writers when I was coming up either. That's why I had to become one. And so that's something to keep in mind, that you might be the one blazing the trail. You don't even know it at the time, but you might, if you believe in it that much, then do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is going to come from Ana. So Ana, this is Ana.
Okay.
Ana, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to read it?
I can unmute. Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So I kind of wrote it down, but I said, in Peel Me a Girl and throughout the book, you touch on masculinity and how gender played a role in your life. How at one point you write how you would put your head down when passing men on the street. So I wanted to ask how you were able to surpass that moment in your life, how you are able to move past the dominance you faced or are facing now as a woman writer.
We still have, and we hear about it now with this administration, we have a patriarchal culture. I don't want to say we have a macho culture, because it's a macho world. I've traveled a lot of places in this world, including the Middle East, and believe me, it's alive and doing well. And the extremes of that, I wrote a little bit about it in Massacre of the Dreamers before I had ever had the opportunity to travel to the Middle East. But there are places there where, believe me, they don't play. A woman just by herself, standing on the street by herself, you could feel, there's nobody around, but you can almost feel those eyes, like, why are you out here by yourself? So we have those extremes all the way to now where maybe you feel fine walking across campus, and maybe some days you don't, but so that still exists. And it's not just a generational, or to say, now that I'm an old lady, nobody's going to look at me. I'm still a female, and so I can still feel that sense of a predatory world. And how do you get past that? It's a constant reminder. And I think that's where the Chicana feminist or Chicanismo framework helps, because you have to almost have that talk with yourself all the time. What spaces you have a quote unquote right to be in, how you have a right to live on your own, or be in your, have your own space and not be afraid. And those are the things that we constantly have to tell ourselves. And having been a quiet person, more introverted, more timid in my younger years. I had to teach myself to speak out. I was a mess, as a kid. I mean, teenager, I was just tongue-tied all the time. And when I started writing a poet and started writing poetry and became a public speaker, I mean, it was shocking to my family to see me stand up in a crowd or in a park and talking and so on. So you have to teach yourself to speak out in those spaces. And then one of the hardest places to speak out sometimes is inside the walls of your own home. And that could be to your brother, to your father, to your boyfriend. As a college professor, unfortunately, I've known too many situations with young Latinas who are with their boyfriends, who are getting an education, are in our classes and getting all this information, and are still in controlling and in abusive situations, and they just don't know where to turn. And they feel, afraid and trapped in those situations. So you have to have the consciousness first, you have to have the analysis first to give you that strength. And then you have to just say it, learn the laws. If you don't like the laws, help change them. When I was in college, for example, in the 70s, rape was not a primary offense. And a rapist, first of all, would be the victim that would be put on trial if she went to the police or so on. So that was a horrible place to be. And my generation helped change those laws by speaking out and by finding our strength and our unity. So all of that combined together, I think, is part of what will help you. And going back to the previous question, helps your identity. You will always be perceived a certain way, as brown women, particularly not only as a woman, but also as a woman who looks primarily indigenous, and I still have the long straight hairs. It's almost like this indigenous figure in the street that people always assume equates passivity and submissiveness until you start talking, right? Or until they find out, she speaks English. Oh, and she's, telling me off now. How dare she? But when they first see you, they assume there's these assumptions that are still going on. And so you're always, every day you go out in the street, you go into a store, you go to an airport, wherever you travel, people are going to make those assumptions. And it's up to you to have that ammunition of your understanding, your awareness, and the language to put people in their place.
Thank
I
you.
hope that helps a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Great response. And it also reminds me of the moment in the book where you describe your son, Marcelo. I think he's about 18 or 19. I picture him in his Che Guevara t-shirt. He's gaining a political consciousness. He's becoming very aware of some of the social issues, but he's still, his interactions with young women are still problematic, and he's not necessarily aware of the impact that he's having on the women around him. So I think that's just, such an important part of the book. And Anna's question about masculinity, I think the other side of that coin is for the young men, on the call, is being aware of ourselves and how we're interacting with women, how we're making women feel when walking down the street, and just having that type of empathy. So Julia, you have a couple of questions. I wonder if you want to unmute, or should I just read your questions?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Now we can.
So one of my questions was, with your experiences with religion and spirituality, how do you identify spiritually? So do you still identify as Catholic, or do you identify with multiple religions or spiritual beliefs?
I think that the truest answer would be my, as a Chicana, also my combination. We used to call it the synchronicity of my indigenous heritage and background with the cultural inheritance of the Catholic religion that I inherited in my family. And so it's a fusion, and it's very particular to me. I put in the new Massacre of the Dreamers, an essay that came from a lot of independent research that I did in my search for the Virgen de Guadalupe, because spiritually speaking, as a young woman, I turned to her as Guadalupe Tonantzin, as possibly Guadalupe, who is she? But she was, in any event, true to the purposes of the Catholic Church. She was the brown feminine icon that I could identify with. So I really still have a connection with her. But no matter what no matter what happens as time goes on, how much conviction I have about my spirituality, I will tell you that it's always changing, and as I mentioned earlier, it changes with the decades you are in, the challenges you have in life. Like ourselves, like our bodies, like the molecules that make up our bodies, we are always shedding, the dry skin and regenerating. And so the same way is the spirituality that I experience. So I have a little bit of the Catholicism in me, mostly because it's sentimental for me. It ties me to my ancestors and my immediate ancestors. The Virgen de Guadalupe is a very important symbol to me. And she also, I think, represents many goddesses around the world historically that unify us, and reminds me that although we don't have a record of it, before patriarchy, there was a matriarchy that ran societies, a different way of looking at the world. So that's my spirituality, is that I still hold on to that. What makes me get up every morning, and being the same brown, smallish figure that doesn't seem to the world as very powerful. What gives me power, what empowers me, is having those connections and knowing that, I belong to that. I belong to this great big universe, and we are all connected in that sense. And so that's what keeps moving me forward. And sometimes it doesn't have words. Sometimes there isn't a way to articulate it, but it's a sense of being.
Thank you.
Yes, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I did a book some time ago called The Goddess of the Americas, La Diosa de las Américas, that was actually asked for by a major publisher, so it's still in publication. And I invited many writer friends to talk about it, regardless of their religious background. And so you might want to take a look at it. But when I called the book The Goddess of the Americas, which was, they wanted a book on the Virgen de Guadalupe, at that time, 25 years ago, this was blasphemous still to say. Now you hear Goddess of the Americas and everybody's like cool with it. Nobody was saying that then. And so that was one of those times in which I felt I had to assert that sense of identity and assert that place of this feminine universal power. So I recommend that also if you'd like to read a little bit more about that subject.
Thank you.
Yes.
And sorry, did someone have a question? Okay. So this question actually reminds me of the discussion of mestizaje, which comes up a lot in your book, but you also, it's not just sort of relegated to indigenous and Spanish, but you sort of open up Afro-Latino influences and also African-American influences from your childhood in Chicago. So that's a preface to this question from Karen and Crystal. And you also talk about, the book came out in 2016, and you talk about Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. So Karen and Crystal are asking, how are today's injustices relating to police brutality, the mass incarceration of young people of color, Black Lives Matter movement, etc., similar to or different from what you experienced growing up in Chicago and as a past?
Yes, I grew up in a time that was uh, much more extreme. I was born and raised in Chicago. In Chicago, it almost looked like a police state. It was unapologetically racially divided. As a brown person, I knew that not to be walking randomly in a white neighborhood and not to walk randomly in an all Black neighborhood. The first neighborhood I grew up in that was knocked down, plowed down for gentrification purposes was a mixed neighborhood. And so as I did write in Black Dove, my playmates were African American and Latino and Italian, but at the public school, it was the African American children mostly that went there where I went. But then when I was 14 years old and there was all kinds of stuff exploding in Chicago, and then of course Martin Luther King and all of that, I had all kinds of consciousness around that. But the police have always been notorious for for their aggression. I experienced it. I experienced it as a girl. I experienced it as a young woman. I even now I still laugh when some of the things that I see on TV, and I think everybody knows not to make eye contact. If a cop car pulls up next to you, not to make eye contact. You just keep looking straight ahead, because that's the kind of intimidation I grew up with. And unfortunately, as a mother with my son, the only time I ever saw my son beat up, as you all know in this book, he spent a year in federal prison, but as far as I know, nobody ever touched him. The only time that I know that I saw him beaten up and his face purple and black eye was when some cops beat him up right by our house. I didn't know about it. He was coming home, he was at the university, he had a joint in his pocket, and he got afraid when they asked him, they wanted to talk to him, and he got afraid and he started, running or walking too fast. They grabbed a hold of him and beat him up in the alley. Now, by that point, I'm the writer that I am now. I was also a professor at the same university. Did I call the Chicago police? No, I didn't, because my experience had been is that, first of all, how am I going to prove anything? And second of all, they'll go looking for him. So I understand entirely what is going on right now in the streets and the intimidation that people feel, but primarily younger people. But not everybody that's caught and abused by the police are kids, and we saw that this summer as the result of these with these riots. That you can be an older person and still get intimidated and abused by the police. So I think that it's something that has to be reckoned with, and I believe will be. I've 24 hours before the election. I believe we will be dealing with it because we have to.
Thank you. Yolanda, I see that you have a question. I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself. But first, I'll just share with Ana that our student Yolanda here happens to do some writing herself. So sorry if I put you on the spot there, but go ahead, Yolanda, and share your question.
I was just wondering, well, nice to meet you, first of all. I was just wondering what your college experience was. Like, how did you feel about going and how you felt through your experience of graduating and stuff?
I'm sorry, my what experience?
Like your college experience?
Yeah, well, again, you got to putting it in perspective at the time that I decided to pursue college, higher education, in the atmosphere that I was in. My parents, may they rest in peace, they wanted to see their children finish high school so that we might not end up in factories like they were in. But that was the extent of it. So I didn't have any encouragement along those lines. but I did have that consciousness, and with that analysis, I knew that if I didn't do something, there was already a mold there for a brown girl from working class family in Chicago, and I didn't want that for myself. So I did I pursued what was available to me, which was to go to community college. And I might have written a little bit about that in the essay of Peel Me a Girl. So I went to a community college downtown in Chicago, where there were guys in the elevator, by the elevator, selling drugs, and so I had to kind of go through that, and then I wrote about how I had escaped a near rape experience with one of the activists, Latino activists. So it was like in this urban environment, but I was very determined. I took my studies very seriously and passed my classes to take my electives. And once I was done with my electives, I had found a state college that I could transfer to. At that state college, I took my last 2 years and majored in art education. And there was very few Latinos, very, very few. The first year there was a Puerto Rican student union. So I kind of participated with them, and many of my friends were Puerto Rican anyway. But by the second year, the Chicanos, there was enough Chicanos to have like a Chicano student union. And so that was my little clique. And we actually got our first Chicano instructor. It was my very first and only Chicano professor I ever had in my life. I mean, it was just like, to have somebody talking about your history and your background in a classroom. So that was my college experience. And I want to just say, as a shout out to that university, was that right now, this month, I was given the news of being nominated as their distinguished alumnus for 2020, and we'll be giving their graduation commencement via Zoom. But I'm so happy that they followed me and that they were proud of me coming out at that time and have followed my long journey. There was very, very few of us, but that didn't make any difference for me. It was that, as I said earlier, if the path isn't there, maybe you're the one that has to make it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good luck to
Thank you. That is such a great response. And just to repeat what Ana said in different words, that means she was a first generation Latina college student, transfer student from a community college, went on to receive her bachelor's degree. And if I'm not mistaken, you have a master's from the University of Chicago?
Yeah.
And a PhD?
And I have and the PhD is from Germany, which also came as a result of the books and the writing that I was doing. And it's the book Massacre of the Dreamers, and later received an honorary degree from Colby College in Maine for Massacre of the Dreamers. And Colby, I didn't know until then, is the first college in the United States. It's in Maine, up in the East Coast. So that's, you never know. And I wrote Massacre of the Dreamers not for academia, not as a PhD, but I wrote it because I had to write it. As I said, a lot of things, sometimes they're not there, therefore you have to go and do it. And the documentation of the Chicana and who we were wasn't written out. There's people writing at the time, and especially poetry, and I was part of that too, but we hadn't written it in empirical essay form, which is go out and do the research and the documentation. So when they say you're just an angry Chicana, you can say, well, I have a reason to be angry. Yes, I am, and I have a reason, and I'll tell you why. So that was a long journey with Massacre of the Dreamers.
Yeah, we're angry, and we have documentation for why.
I can tell you why.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Ana. So this really concludes the first event. Stick around, Puentistas. We're going to have the second event. Don't forget, there's a separate Zoom link. Ana, I hope you were able to register. If not, we can talk in the break. For the second Zoom link is on a different link through the webinar.
Okay. Are you talking to me, Ana? Because
Yes.
I have that link. Do
Okay,
I have
great.
to? Okay.
Yeah, so you have to register first, and then you'll get an email that gives you the actual link. So just go ahead and
Okay.
register first, please.
All right.
Puentistas, we're going to take a short break. We will be back. So the next class period begins at 11:10. I'm going to start my introduction at 11:20. Ana will be there at 11:30. Please don't be late. Bring your notebooks. Can we unmute and say thank you? Round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Good luck
Thank you so much.
to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm
Yeah,
gonna
so-
sign up. Okay.
Yeah,
Bye.
so if you go back to the email I sent this morning, I
Yes, I will.
included that
Yes.
second link, and then just
Yes.
register for that. Like I said, I'll start the intro around 11:20. And we have some slides. We'll have the playlist playing, so people will be coming in. So
All right, thank you.
thank you.
Mr. Wendes,
Yes.
where's the playlist? I don't see it on the email.
Yeah, because I'm waiting for a few to give me their songs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for 2 students, and then I'll send it out. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to shut this down. I'll see you guys in the other one.
Sounds good. And this is going so great.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, see
Halfway
you.
there.